Invisibles, a difference of orientation. If invisibles are invisible, you might ask, how can anyone see them? This is a perfectly legitimate question, one that should embarrass no one. Yet, if it is a legitimate question, it is also a delicate one. Those who are already sensitive to invisibles have probably developed definite ideas about them. And in the various occultisms, there are many structures or models that try to incorporate the invisibles in some sort of order. These structures are often adhered to very rigidly and tend to divide occultology into schismatic factions that in turn operate along the lines of some special power force game. Proper occultology is the study of energies that unify all things. It incorporates the study of force cycles that individuate within the energies and bring separations into the actions of humanity. The only things that are truly visible to us are those things our physical senses can perceive, and through them, the actions we can see taking place in the physical universe. Everything else is technically invisible, but only a very few of us conform our lives completely to the world of the visible, and various invisibles invade our awarenesses all the time. By way of examples, most of us are aware of our telepathic connectedness to our parents, family, and loved ones. We also pick up on vibes in general, extending our awarenesses into the locales around us. Survival often depends upon this, especially concerning dangers. We know when we are loved or when we are hated. Sexual attraction is totally invisible, as are all emotions in general. Even if we can create mental pictures out of our thoughts, the thought processes that create them are totally invisible. Our sense of spirituality and religiousness is invisible, as are the charismatic attractions of art, philosophy, and learning. Normally, we objectify, project all these invisibles into some kind of visible form, the object symbol. The objectification process itself remains invisible unless it is brought to our conscious attention through one method or another. One of the basic goals of occultology is to make the invisible visible, to bring the invisible out of its hidden state into some sort of focus, to increase the cutting edge between the visible and the invisible. The invisible universes are incredibly more vast than the visible universe. The invisibles extend well beyond the world of matter, beyond our illusion boundaries, beyond our frames of references, beyond the concepts of ourselves as individuals. When we shift the laws or rules that are holding these in place, new invisibles immediately become perceptible to us, often called new realities. The invisibles can be perceived through two major methods: through direct psychic experience, mystical, revelatory, telepathic, clairvoyant, and mental thought forms, and through study of the object symbols that serve as a concrete focus for the invisible energies and forces that are being projected onto and into them. Prior to our modern epoch, anything that was concretely visible or perceptible was the working arena of occultology. But today, our sciences have made considerable progress in studying the invisibles behind the visible, an important factor that present-day occultists are more or less obliged to take into account. The modern sciences that study these invisibles are legitimately occult sciences, since they are studying the invisible phenomena behind the visible. These sciences might not like to suffer along with the stigma that has accompanied occultism through the rise of the Age of Enlightenment that rejected invisibles out of hand. But technically, they are systems of developing occultology cast into scientific frameworks. The great work of scientific materialism. The hallmark of the Western physical sciences, a very great achievement that many pseudo-occultists frequently put down, has been science's accumulating ability to make perceivable, through instruments, the many physical influences that are invisible in the physical sense. The discovery of the electromagnetic spectrum opened up the universe of the physical invisibles to science, and today radio waves, brain waves, ultrasonics, and so forth have become commonplace in our cultural awareness. Even today, this important work is progressing. We are now aware of such concepts as the biosphere, the geomagnetosphere, and the interspace plasma, and it is now known and understood, although weakly so far, that these transfer energies and fluxes through them and are the unexpected sources of many mysterious phenomena. The inroads of psychology. Psychology has almost made many inroads into the invisibles, those of the consciousness and the unconscious mind. The concepts of the personal unconscious, or subconscious, and the collective unconscious have become well-rooted, even though not understood very well. The great work of the first part of the New Age will be to expand human comprehension in these areas. The only difference is one of orientation. The only really great difference about the invisibles is one of orientation. The Western scientist views the invisibles as separate puzzles, whereas they should be viewed as part of one larger puzzle. The Western scientist, now very aware of invisible influences, still studies them as independent phenomena in isolation from each other rather than as integrated phenomena, each having a place in the greater holistic scheme of the universe. The Western scientist searches for what separates phenomena from each other rather than for what integrates them, because all phenomena constitute an integer, a complex entity, a holism. The rebirth of holism. The dawn of holistic science was the dawn of the Aquarian Age. Although holistic science had individual predecessors before the 1950s, it began emerging as a group effort in the 1960s. Holism emphasizes the organic or functional relations between parts and their wholes, and this is contrasted with atomism, which held that the universe is composed of many simple elements that were divided, or unconnected, into antagonistic fragments. Although holism is evolving today, many scientists still cling to the former paradigm of atomism. Traditionally, holism has been the foundation of occultology. Occultology further established that the whole was only 1% visible and conscious, while all the rest was invisible. As we have seen, the occultists first of all divided these invisibles into two major groupings, energies and forces. After identifying their major attributes, the occultists then set about studying the influences that exchanged between them. Out of these studies came the various arts and crafts of occultology, from which descended the various occultures, some of which are effective and some of which are not. How to conceptualize invisibles. The word invisible is a big word in occultism. In fact, the very word and title occultism derives from it. Invisible means incapable by nature of being seen, inaccessible to view, hidden. Hidden is the primary definition of the Latin word from which the word occult is derived. While we can carry the word invisible along with us, we still have to understand what the occultist meant exactly by it. To the occultist, nothing was invisible in the sense that it was incapable of being perceived. To get at this, we have to remind ourselves that occultology, in spite of the myths that have grown up around it, is ruled by common sense. If something is incapable of being perceived, then it never will be perceived at all. To the occultist, something is invisible only to the degree that we do not have the right tools for making it visible, or the correct thinking to make it apparent. What you cannot think about will be, to you, quite invisible. It will not exist, and will not make sense to you even if others say they have perceived it. To the occultist, the word occult means not revealed, concealed, or secret. If occultists held that nothing was irrevocably invisible, then they did not mean by invisible what we today mean by it. So, what did they mean by it? To get an idea of what they meant, we have to make a very subtle but extraordinarily important mental shift, one that only a very few holistic psychologists are learning to make today. A basic mental shift. Our Western culture has taught us to learn to think from ourselves outward, which is well and fine so far as that goes. But this objective and scientific technique has brought about one fatal flaw in Western-type thinking. We can see our body, and we can see ourselves as reflected in the responses of those about us. But we can no longer perceive ourselves except through the impacts we can make on the people and environment around us. If we fail to make these impacts, which we often do, we become totally invisible to ourselves. The sense of alienation that comes about as a result of this is quite terrible and problematic to our present cultural difficulties. In this way, we differ radically from other cultures, especially those of the East, and especially from those forms that first established workable forms of occultology. Persia, India, Tibet, China, and Mongolia, in all probability, the lost empires of Carthage, Greece, and Macedonia, early Israel, and most certainly the indigenous peoples of the Americas, whose traditional cultures still carry forward a rare working occultology. There is fantastically clear evidence that each of these cultures thought from the outside inwards, from the greater to the lesser. This is the exact opposite of the Western mode that has traditionally thought from the lesser to the greater, or, at any rate, tried to do so. In other words, the above-mentioned ancient cultures were holistic cultures, or at least based on a type of holism that made visible to them many facets and factors of the invisible universes around them. These holisms might have been delimited by natural and cultural peculiarities, but holisms they were, and this accounts for how it was that occult secrets found easy currency and were traded between the different groupings. The holistic invisibles, under different names, under different symbolic gods and goddesses, were recognized across the natural and cultural boundaries and appreciated for what they were, as symbols representing the various energies and forces that lay behind them. In the holistic cultures, the individual could sense oneself as a part within the whole and respond accordingly. In the West, where individuals must model the whole from themselves outwards, the whole takes on only the inner characteristics of the individual, who then finds the whole unsatisfactory. The psychological turmoil that results is cloying and stays that way until, through some set of circumstances, individuals recognize a greater beyond themselves and undergo a metaphysical catharsis of some kind. We all have to individuate to some degree, but if this individuating process takes place in the total absence of any sense of an intertwined holism, the result can be catastrophic to the individual's psychology. In the United States, the complete nadir, the lowest point, was exemplified by the me generation of the 1970s. But there had been other me generations before, most notably during the Roman Empire, when the emperors set the example by declaring themselves gods rather than a servant of them. This rather severe individuation within the whole served to turn the inner persona inside out, to make what was the inner persona the whole of the universes. These Roman gods knew no law other than what they conceived or desired, and the personal sagas of each of these Roman gods is the strange mixture of megalomania and atrocity we find recorded in history books. Rome is the beginning of all the dominant elements in Western civilization, by virtue of the fact that Roman legions conquered and ruled the nations comprising the West and instilled in them the basic Roman heritage that separates the West from the East. Conceptually, this difference can be simplified. Philosophically, the West tends to hold to the saying, "We are all gods." The East tends to hold to the saying, "We all are of God." The West says, "We have the infinite in us." The East, "We all share in the infinite." The West feels that we must search for universals from the smallest, the individual, to the greater. The East holds that we must locate ourselves in the greater first in order that the lesser, us, will make sense. In other words, the East subscribes to holism first and individuation second, while the West subscribes to individuation first, building its holisms solely out of what each individual can perceive as reality. These differences might at first appear subtle and small, but adequate reflection upon them reveals many things that have always remained a mystery in the West. It explains, for example, why the philosophies of the West have graduated downwards to dominant materialism and why the philosophies of the East have remained dominantly spiritual. Without recourse to spiritual realities, the Western individual cannot resolve many issues that are kids' play to an Eastern. The Westerner is, in effect, almost forced to cling to the only stable reality in the immediate view outside oneself, the material. Matter becomes the message and the answer to it. It also explains why those Westerners who sense the inadequacies of their own basic philosophies tend to drink deeply of imported Eastern concepts. To the hardcore Westerner, the individual is a god, and the universe in which they live is that of matter. The only spiritual messages to survive apart from the consecration of matter in the West were those of Jesus, the Christ, although his church has frequently fallen into abstract materialism. In defense of Western philosophy, historians have even tried to reconceptualize the historical great Greeks, even Plato and Aristotle, neither of whom, of course, were confirmed materialists. While the West has birthed its own forms of occultology, these have been generally persecuted. Paracelsus, alchemy, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, etc. The importation of Eastern thought into the West began with the adventures of Marco Polo, along with the influx of printing, explosives, tea, and the secrets of manufacturing delicate, durable china. The greatest influx of Eastern thought occurred under the aegis of Theosophy during the latter part of the 19th century. But up until the advent of psychology, quantum physics, and now, of course, chaos theory, the general emergence of the need for a new holism is being personified as the New Age consciousness. 4 types of occult invisibles. Both Western and Eastern occultists have identified many different types of invisibles, but 4 of these are isolated as being of primary importance. They overlap considerably, and in reality cannot be considered much apart from each other, even though they have distinct differences. They are invisible to the physical senses, invisible to consciousness, invisible in the unconscious mind, and invisible in spirit. Each of these invisibles is only invisible to the degree that there are barriers thrown up by self against it. As we have seen, these barriers are composed of inadequate frames of references, cultural and value conditioning, imprinting, and illusion barriers. When the self accepts a given reality, only the information that fits with that reality will be accepted, and all other information will be rejected. This phenomena is pretty well accepted as real by today's advancing human psychology. It is also known that frames of reference can expand to incorporate new realities, or contract, or harden to exclude new information. When new information is resisted, the individual feels smaller, contracted, and threatened, and begins to dramatize the rightness of his or her frames of reference, bringing hardships on all in the environment. Psychology knows that cultural and value imprinting are in the large part responsible for an individual's frames of reference. But what psychology hasn't yet accepted is something that has traditionally been accepted in occultology, that each individual is carrying within a vast unconscious reservoir of past life experiences, many elements of which can and do become activated. The individual is also carrying within a reservoir of excarnate knowledge about spiritual states that can become activated upon occasion, bestowing upon the individual a strength that is, as Dr. M. Scott Peck has admitted, a total mystery to psychology. Footnote number 62. See The Road Less Traveled, A New Psychology of Love, Traditional Values and Spiritual Growth by M. Scott Peck. The erection of any or all of these barriers is a fundamental psychic process that renders invisible all factors that cannot be contained within the barriers. This has often been called the tragedy of the spirit incarnate. No spirit can see outside the self-created barriers unless a conscious and deliberate effort is made to break them down. Otherwise, spirit is trapped inside them. Occultology teaches that one cannot truly contact other realities while at the same time maintaining one's barriers. Any attempt to do so only reshapes the new reality in a form that fits within the already existing barriers. In other words, a form of illusion made up solely out of one's barrier-bound imagination. One hears of a new reality and, wondering what it must be like, imagines it in conformity with what one already accepts. Reality barriers are sometimes weakened through this method, but far more frequently the person only reshapes the new reality in a form that is easier for him or her to reject. This is called maintaining one's ego integrity. Ego being the essential me made up of several sets of boundaries. Any defense of the ego me will eventually require force of some kind, greater or lesser, depending upon the individual. One of the primary ways the ego me defends itself is by joining others who share the same boundaries, usually by affiliating with power force games already underway. Once encapsulated in these, the ego me feels secure by association, but becomes victim to the cycle of the power force itself. This type of experience activity is referred to as the trial of the spirit by fire and ashes. These trials by fire and ashes constitute what seems on the surface to be an endless series of cycles in which the incarnating spirit seems trapped. And so it is until it reaches out beyond its barriers in a valid way called the voluntary releasing of one's boundaries. Nothing outside one's individual boundaries can compel one to do this. When duress through force is brought against one set of ego boundaries, the duress might be strong enough or clever enough to persuade. But what is actually happening is that the ego internalizes, represses its former boundaries and accepts the new boundaries it is being forced into. In this manner, the indwelling spirit becomes encapsulated within a multitude of misadventures of this kind, called the Wheel of Travail, which turns endlessly according to occult doctrine. This wheel is also often referred to as the downward spiral, in which all else except the immediate elements of the encapsulating experience are invisible. Footnote number 63. The law of internationality states that the less you put into perception, the less you will get out. How does one get out of all this? There are several exits or off-ramps. A sense of inadequacy leading to active exploration of other realities is a more common one. But if this exploration does not begin to include an admission that there are invisibles one can perceive, whatever liberation one achieves by the exploration is most likely to be only short-term. Only by building up a conscious expectation that there are invisibles beyond one's frames of reference and illusion barriers can one begin to have a valid appreciation of them. Occultology teaches a peculiar process for beginning this shift of reference, a process that has reached popular cognizance in Zen. Footnote number 64. Popularized in Western culture by Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. There are hardly any equivalent words in English to portray this process, but it goes something like this. If you try to concentrate upon what is invisible to you, it stays invisible because you are already conceiving it to be invisible. You can only imagine what is invisible, and this imagining will take place within your given present barriers, which will remain inviolate. The basic problem is that your barriers themselves are invisible. You are living inside them, and so their peripheries are not actually sensed, or, if they are not identifiable with regard to their special characteristics. The barrier remains an invisible paradox, unresolvable until the paradox explodes, is resolved, and vanishes. The barrier dissolves, and it is as if it never was, which is true because, in fact, it was only a mentally imagined barrier in the first place. This type of event has been referred to in historical occultology as exteriorization, or some other word meaning approximately the same thing. One gets outside one's barriers, at which time they become apparent for what they are or were. The Zen master works with students and perceives their problem barriers. The Zen process is to increase stress or tension on the barrier until it destabilizes and explodes. The Zen master utilizes what we call in English riddles, but are properly known as koans, for which there is no English equivalent. Westerners tend to treat the koans as a type of intellectual exercise, but actually they are therapies to accentuate an intolerable pressure at the barrier level, culminating in a sudden flash of insight. As an example, we might pose the koan, I am small, I am large. When we begin to reflect on this, I as small and I as large are at first both invisible. Since ego normally does not appreciate its size, only its essence as a unified existence. With adequate reflection or meditation, two sets of boundaries ultimately become visible. Those that prevented the ego from perceiving how small it is, and those that prevented it from perceiving how large it is. The boundaries release their holding force, and a new orientation, liberation, takes place. The I can be either small or large, depending upon how it is thinking of itself. I-ness exteriorizes from those particular boundaries, and a new set is ready to be exploded, equally invisible at first to the individual, but perceivable to the experienced Zen master. The process continues, the master ever guiding the student upwards to higher, culminating flashes of insight, culminating eventually by general illumination and by transcendence onto increasingly higher planes of spiritual realities. What has happened is that one's frames of reference and illusion boundaries are disassembled. The mental force holding them in place exploded until what was invisible before gradually becomes visible. That is, perceivable by the individual. There are other ways in occultology to render the invisible visible. But, like Zen, they are all based upon the necessity of shifting one's frames of reference and erasing illusions. Like all other things, these are held in place by the way we think about them. As mentioned above, if we continue to think invisibles are invisible, we can never perceive them. Occultists teach a slight and subtle, but immensely powerful method for overcoming this situation. If we cast our thinking not to what is invisible, to what is other than visible, our thought parameters reform themselves to accommodate the other than visibles. In occultology, this is frequently referred to as reversing definitions. Reversing definitions is very roadworthy. As an example, if you are being consumed by hate for someone, you can reserve the definition by reflecting upon the question, what is other than hateable about that individual? You might experience some emotional tremors as your hate barrier for that person weakens and explodes, getting outside, as it were, of your hate. True, the basic reason you found the person detestable might remain evident, but your self-imposed hate barrier will release its force hold on your emotions, and you will have recontacted the whole of that person. We should seldom concern ourselves with these local problems of the encapsulated ego, and instead concentrate on major issues that, once comprehended, will bring about major large-scale releases in which many minor situations will automatically be resolved. Earlier on in this chapter, I identified 4 types of invisibles that are the common and important domains of occultology. The invisibles concern the physical, the conscious, the unconscious, and the spiritual. If we reshape our thought approach to these and recast it in the other-than framework, we can ask, what is other than visible to the physical senses? What is other than visible to consciousness? What is other than visible in the unconscious mind? What is other than visible in spirit? This question reversal is also a reversal in frames of reference. If you think about what is other than visible to the physical senses, an entire new panorama will open up. Barriers will appear and explode, slightly jolting at first, but quickly followed by a sense of release and exteriorization from the former boundaries. In this framework, this other-than-reversal technique serves to reconnect awareness to increasing holism's wholes, in which the former barriers were only introverting mechanisms of individuation within the whole. One word of caution. Progress in moving invisibles over into awarenesses should be kept with some sort of personal counsel. You will soon see that others around you are doing no such thing as you are. They are remaining encapsulated in their frames of reference and illusion barriers, and will do so until they are self-motivated to do otherwise. They will defend their barriers and frames of reference, often at their own costs, and yours. It is for much this reason that occultology became a secret art, operating behind the scenes of Power Force games. Power Force games represent exactly what is implied: powerfulness. Footnote number 65. Editor's note. Ingo would go on to expand on this concept in his Secrets of Power books. Power Force games, even at the individual level, can wreak terrific havoc when threatened. If by this point Power Force games are remaining invisible to you, or you are having trouble identifying them, don't ask what is a Power Force game, but ask yourself what is other than a Power Force game. A few of them will soon become visible to you, together with their constituent elements of force. The first stage of developing extrasensory perception. It follows from all the above that as you begin to shift invisibles into perceptibility, those sensing parameters commonly today called extrasensory perception, ESP, will become activated. In fact, all those invisibles that cannot be perceived through the physical senses are extrasensory, a slightly overworked term in our day and time. In parapsychology, ESP is confined to telepathy and clairvoyance, with some extension into what is called prevision or prediction. But contemporary understandings of each of these are themselves governed by frames of reference and certain illusion boundaries that have come to characterize them in a parapsychological way. It is not all that wise to cling wholeheartedly to modern conceptions of them. Telepathy is thought to be thought transmission, but actually there are several dozens of modes of telepathy, just as are there several modes of clairvoyance. Any refinement of these talents can only take place after the self has become revitalized enough that it can perceive energies and forces, each in their own importances. This is only logical, since telepathy and clairvoyance cannot very well be expected to work through erected barriers that exclude their particular realities. The sensing and perception of all invisibles represents the extrasensory domain major, and as one progresses into comprehending invisibles, the overall ambiance of one's extrasensory gifts will increase accordingly, often with surprises that are quite refreshing. But, as any accomplished psychic will agree, none of the specific psychic talents we are popularly familiar with will function very well, if at all, within frames of reference and illusion barriers that exclude them in the first place. Yet, all of them, telepathy, intuition, prophecy, clairvoyance, etc., are part and parcel of spirit and its native attributes. As ego boundaries disappear, one's native endowment begins to surface, and, along with that, any or all of the specific psychic talents. These specific ESP talents need to be located specifically before consciousness can deal with them adequately. Many invisibles can correctly be intuited by the conscious brain, but the vast majority of psychic perceptions are first processed through the unconscious elements of the human spiritual framework. In the unconscious also reside various frames of reference and illusion barriers. The unconscious is the major working territory for the neophyte, the elements of the incarnate conscious ego being quite small in comparison.